What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel. I paint minis, build dioramas, and do other cool hobby projects. In this week's video, we're going to be diving into a classic D&D encounter with a slight twist. Somehow, a blood elf from World of Warcraft has run into a mimic from D&D. This should be interesting. If you don't know what a mimic is, get ready to be terrified. Mimics are shape-shifting monsters from Dungeons & Dragons that take the form of normal objects, usually to catch adventurers off guard and hopefully get a meal out of it. Now, while there are many monsters that inhabit the dungeons and depths of D&D, one of the most iconic and deadly is the mimic. Now, they can take many forms, but they're often depicted as living, breathing treasure chests. It's a horrifying beast that's always looking to ensnare and consume any adventurer that's foolish enough to get too close. I thought it would be kind of cool to make an encounter showing a mimic attacking a blood elf, who happens to be from World of Warcraft. In this corner, weighing in at 105 pounds, not including armor, we have Volnath Dewsmile, a blood elf adventurer who has an obsession over gold. And in the other corner, we have Mimic, weighing in at the approximate weight of a chest filled with gold and treasure. This little chonk has a tongue on him that lets him grab a hold of unsuspecting adventurers. But what happens when the adventurer fights back? Wait and see in tonight's fight. Okay, you get it. It's a throwdown. Now, I snagged these little guys off of My Mini Factory from 2 different stores. They are both free, and I'll have the stores linked in the description below if you want to check them out. And while you're down there, drop a comment to let me know who you think would win in a fight, a mimic or a blood elf. I'm going to be painting these guys up before I make the scene, and I'll be starting with the blood elf. I've named this guy Volnath Dewsmile because I thought it sounded badass, and I've always enjoyed coming up with fantasy names. I should clarify, so that I don't get eaten alive in the comments, that blood elves do exist in D&D, but are far more commonly recognized in the World of Warcraft universe. Without knowing a ton about World of Warcraft myself, I did some brief research and found that blood elves are former high elves who renamed themselves in honor of their people who were killed during a siege of some sort. How my blood elf, Volnath, ended up in the D&D universe, we'll never know. Maybe an interdimensional portal or something. Regardless, he's here and he's fighting this mimic. Before getting into the details of Volnath's armor, I'm blocking out all of these with base coats and shapes. Red went down first, as the most dominant color because, well, he's a blood elf. But because I'm starting with this color and working my way out to the details, I know it's going to be okay if some paint strays outside the lines, since I'll be covering it up later with the next layers of paint. After getting the red down, I came in with Vallejo's Flat Earth for the trim and parts that I will paint gold later on. This acts as a nice, darker base coat for the gold to really adhere to without me needing to do 3 or 4 layers of the gold paint. I'm also going to be adding some of Vallejo's wood grain to the wooden parts of the shield, and finally, I'm going to be adding a darker green to a few of the jewels that this blood elf has on his armor. Working from in to out is a common technique that lots of painters do so they don't want to pull their hair out. If you know that your primary color is going to be underneath lots of details, getting that base coat down and knowing that some might get on the other details is okay, because when you get to the details, you'll be painting right over them. It's a lot easier than painting all of your details and then trying to finagle your paintbrush and paint of your primary color in between all those details. For my mini, the colors are my dominant red and then my detail color, which will be gold. I put down my red base coat first, and then next I'll be coming in with the gold. Of course, I have to hedge and say that this isn't the only way to paint a mini. Everyone has their own process and way of going about it. Some painters like to work from one section, working from base coat to completion before moving on to the next, and it's totally fine. As you grow and learn, your process may change, and that's good. That means you're getting better and you're learning from your past mistakes or things that took too long or frustrated you. If you have a surefire technique or process that you use, drop a comment below so that we can all learn together and get better. As I put the finishing touches on our friend Volnath here, I'm focusing on details such as his sword, adding highlights to the jewels, and adding wood grain to the shield. I know elves always look pristine, but I figure if this elf is in a dirty dungeon exploring, then he will have had some grime and dirt build up on his boots and garments. Maybe even some blood on his sword too. And that's Volnath done. I'm digging the red pop of color, and I think the gold trim shows the superiority complex that comes with his blood elfiness. Now, to paint up our chonky mimic friend. To base coat the Mimic, I'm using Vallejo's wood grain on all the wooden parts. On the gooey organic bits like the tongue, gums, and mouth, I'm using a deeper red, purple color that I mixed up on my wet palette. The teeth will be base coated in a super dark brown, which I'm using Vallejo's Smoke mixed with some flat brown to do this. I'm now going to add some lines to the wood imitating grain and highlights. This will help to deepen the colors and add some interest to the mini. To get the color that I want, I'm going to be mixing about 90% of Vallejo's dark sand to 10% of Vallejo's flat earth. This gets me a lighter color that will work perfectly for highlighting. I'm working randomly to get natural lines and textures, and once that's done, I'm going to apply a light wash of Vallejo's Smoke to unify everything. Now remember, all wood does not look the same, so if you want a lighter wood or to add some color to your mini, don't be afraid to experiment with colors and combinations to get a result that you're happy with. With the wooden bits done, I'm moving on to the mouth, tongue, and gums of the Mimic. I'll save the teeth for last so that if I get any paint on them while I work on the mouth, I can easily cover it up later. Remember, working from that in to out method that we talked about earlier. For the mouth, I'm going to build up from the dark, deep red and add highlights on the gums and parts of the roofs of the mouth. Most of it I will keep the dark red since it's recessed and shadowed. For the tongue, I want to blend the base of it from a deep purple to a darker blue color at the tip. I think this adds some color interest and really draws the eye to the tongue. To get a good blend, I'm using a technique called wet blending, where I apply a color and while the paint is still wet, I apply my next color and blend that together to get a good creamy transition. Something to make note of here, acrylic paints dry out super quickly, so adding some water can help ease the wet blend. Alternatively, you could use some glaze mediums as well. This not only thins the paint down nicely, but it also slows the drying time down, which allows for more working time to blend the colors together just how you want. Now that the tongue and gums are done, I need to finish up the teeth. Now I've already base coated it with Vallejo's Smoke, and next I'm going to be mixing in some Vallejo Iraqi sand and Citadel's Karak stone to get my mid-tone. I'm then going to be blending from the smoke base to that mid-tone mixture. I'm directing the brush strokes up towards the tip of the teeth and gradually building up thin layers. It's hard to capture it on camera here since the layers are so thin. Using that same process, this time I'm going to be going from the mid-tone mixture to Morghast Bone as a highlight. Working in equally as thin layers, I'm going to be using some of that wet blending technique that we talked about earlier. Lastly, I'm going to be coming in with some Screaming Skull to add highlights towards the base of the teeth. This stark highlight creates the illusion of shine and glistening teeth. In the same vein of adding a glistening to the teeth, I'm going to be adding the smallest amount of white to a few areas on the gums as well to give it a glistening touch of moisture too. Not all over, but just at a few points that the light might catch and reflect off the surface of the gums. Of course, I can't forget to add the metal parts too, and for this I'm going to be using some of Iron Breaker from Citadel, and if you feel that it's too shiny, you can always add a dark wash of some kind to dull that down. I'm adding this to all the metal bits all over the chest. And there we have it. Our chunky little Mimic is ready to feast on this blood elf. But something is missing from both of these minis. Blood and slobber. This Mimic would be drooling at the thought of eating this elf. And the elf has no doubt fought monsters in this dungeon up to this point. To really add a touch of fun realism to both these minis, I'm going to be adding some blood to the blood elf, because blood, and some slobber to the Mimic. You guys, I have to interrupt to share my story on my quest of how I've been searching for Blood for the Blood Gods by Games Workshop. I have been on the lookout for this sucker for months. It's been sold out on Games Workshop's website. I haven't been able to find it on other online retailers, except for on Amazon where they were trying to sell it for like $25 per pot, which I wasn't going to do. I checked some local stores as well to see if they might have anything, and they did not. They were on back order, or they didn't know when new shipments were going to be coming in. But a few weeks ago, I got to travel for work and got to go home and see my dad, and we have this old hobby store that we used to go to a lot when I was younger as I started getting into the hobby. So we ended up making a trip to the store. So we stopped in, and of course I beelined right for the paint section, and they didn't have it. So my dad, asking what I was looking for, I explained what this was, why I was trying to find it, and why I was getting frustrated that I couldn't track it down anywhere. So, disappointed. I got a couple of things, but I couldn't find the blood for the blood god. My dad on the way home goes, "Oh, I know this little store that we can just stop by. Maybe they'll have it." I wasn't hopeful, but we stopped in this strip mall of sorts, in this teeny little store tucked in the corner, and we're kind of moseying around, and they ended up having a pretty big paint section. So if I'm back in town, I will be going there again. But I'm moseying around, looking around, and at the bottom of the rack, they had it. They had blood for the blood god. I was elated. I was so excited. I, of course, snagged it as soon as I could. The store owner was like, "Yeah, everyone's been coming in here trying to get a hold of it." And now my dad jokes that he's the godfather of sorts. And if I ever need a certain paint, he knows a guy. So thanks, Dad. Anyways, I wanted to share the story because it feeds directly into my next step. And without that, I never would have been able to complete this project. I want to add this stuff to the Blood Elf's sword and shield to show that he's been fighting his way through this dungeon. A little bit goes a long way, but man, I have to say, this stuff looks like genuine blood. I've never used it before, but I have seen lots of other hobbyers use it, and I was stoked to give it a try for myself. Now, to get a cool slobber effect for the Mimic, I'm going to be going with a unique product called Uhu Glue. I picked this up on Amazon, and it's really neat because it's a glue that has an incredible elasticity as it cures. You can kind of take a bit of it, and using a toothpick or something similar, you can sort of wrap it around in between things and the glue will stick to them, like the tongue of this Mimic and his teeth. When it dries super clear, which makes it look like slobber, spit, or slime. Now that we got both of our minis painted up, it's time to build the scene. To start, I'm using some leftover XPS foam from my recent Dwarven Mine entrance diorama. If you haven't seen that project yet, it's super cool, and I'll have part 1 linked in the top right corner of the screen for you to go check out. This XPS foam works perfectly for this scene, as I'll be doing a bit of scribing work, and the density will allow for better detail. I'm taking a block of foam and I'm cutting it in half long ways to get 2 thin pieces of foam. Now you may be wondering why I'm not using my hot wire foam cutter like I did in my other project, and that's because I'm looking to get a rougher stone texture to the foam. You can carve up XPS foam in many ways to get a natural stone look. After slowly going around the foam to bisect it, I carefully pull it apart to reveal the rough cuts that I've been making. It's a really nice starting point for looking like a rough stone texture, like one that you'd see in a dungeon. From there, I cut the rectangular piece in half to make 2 smaller rectangles. I cut out part of one to make it flat and then dry fit both pieces together to make a 90-degree corner. I then take a square piece of XPS foam and cut that in half to make it thinner. This will be the floor piece, and I place the 2 wall pieces on it and it all fits together. I take a tinfoil ball and I roll it across each of the surfaces. This does 2 things. 1, it adds finer texture to each piece of foam. This way there isn't any perfectly flat surfaces. And 2, it softens some of the harsh cut lines and indentations on the wall pieces. This helps to make them look more natural and cohesive. The last step for the floor is to add some slab lines to help break up the flat surface and give some extra visual texture to the space. I start by using my hobby knife to add some lines running perpendicular to each other to create the tiles. Then I come back and add a few cracks and extra lines. From there, I'm going to be taking my metal shaping tools and gray rubber tool to etch in the lines. This creates space between each slab and helps me to better define the cut lines. After getting the foil ball effect on each piece of foam and adding the slab lines to the floor, I use my hot glue gun to glue the pieces of foam together. This little scene takes place in a dark dungeon with maybe a few torches for light, and I want my paint job to reflect that setting. Before painting, I'm going to prime my base in a black coat of paint to ensure that I capture all of the detail in the scene and also get a good blend of light. I'm going to be using a technique called drybrushing. Drybrushing is a technique used to highlight raised edges on a mini or a base. It involves using a dry brush and a minimal amount of paint to subtly highlight textures and highlights in a scene or on a mini. You want to make sure that you're using the right brush for this and not one of your fine-tipped detail brushes. For a dry brush, you want a flat or angled brush with a stiffer set of bristles. Now, I'm using a makeup brush meant for blush and other blending techniques in makeup. I find that it actually works incredibly well. Once you have your brush, place a bit of your paint on your palette. I'm starting with a darker color as I'll work my way up to my highlights. My starter color is a darker gray. Then load the brush with paint by dipping it lightly into the paint, and then you're going to remove most of it on a paper towel or tissue. The brush should appear almost dry. I'm going to start dry brushing in a back and forth motion across the surface to catch any raised areas. I'm being sure to focus on areas that I want to emphasize texture and light on. And because I plan to have the Mimic and Blood Elf in mid-fight, I want to create a sort of light effect of light being cast on them to draw the viewer in. I'm keeping my brush strokes light and controlled to avoid applying too much paint. You can gradually build up the intensity of your highlights by repeating the dry brushing process with lighter layers of paint. Here, you can see that I'm moving from my darker gray to a lighter mid-tone gray as I work across the floor and the walls. Dry brushing helps to achieve a more realistic and blended effect on uneven surfaces, just like this one. Well, I'm editing this video right now, and I'm realizing that I never took the footage of the base without the minis on it. So, I was going to put it in this part of the video, but instead you're getting my beautiful face. Adding the Blood Elf is as easy as gluing him down to the floor. But for the Mimic, I wanted to have him in more of an action pose, sort of leaping through the air, trying to bite the Blood Elf. To achieve this, I ended up using the pinned metal that I had in him for painting as a sort of stand that I could stake into either the wall or the floor. I took my little hand drill and made a hole for the pin to slide into. Then, using some Gorilla Glue, I got the pin in place. I made sure that the Mimic was stable as it dried and got him angled just how I wanted. From that point, I called it done. And check this out, you guys, a little Mimic attack frozen in time. I love how the paint job on these two minis turned out and how the scene looks as a whole. The dry brushing really helps to pull the attention to the minis, not to mention that the slobber and the blood look banging too. A couple of last additions was a barrel and a crate to sort of add to the scene's environment, along with a treasure chest. I hope you liked watching as much as I enjoyed making this project for you guys. If you did enjoy the video, please consider giving me a like or subscribing to my channel. It goes such a long way in getting my content in front of other hobby nerds like you and I. Also, drop a comment below on who you think would win in this fight, a Blood Elf from World of Warcraft or a hungry Mimic. Until next time, keep on crafting.